an ASL interpreter. Our conversation will be recorded and posted on our website and social media channels for later viewing. And we hope you'll share your thoughts on our discussion on social media using the hashtag Catholic2020 and by tagging the initiative on Twitter at GUCST Public Life. And finally, please submit questions to the panelists by following the prompts at the bottom of your screen. Because this is part of our Theology on Tap and Salt and Light program for young adults, we'll be taking their questions first. And as we know, there's going to be no shortage of questions. We're in the thick of a polarizing presidential campaign, a campaign taking place amid a renewed national focus on racism and racial injustice, a global pandemic, and an economic crisis, all within what Pope Francis has called a throwaway culture that consistently fails to protect the most vulnerable among us, including unborn children and their mothers, migrants and refugees, the unemployed, the elderly, and so many more. So tonight, we're here to talk about how we as Catholics should approach this election when so much is at stake, how we should engage in public life as faithful citizens. These days, so many seem to allow their politics to drive their faith. But as Catholics, we know that it's our faith that should shape our politics. We've got a great group lined up here tonight to help us think about what that looks like. And let me tell you a little bit about them. Meghan Clark is an associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University, a senior fellow at the Vincentian Center for Church and Society, and a faculty expert for the Holy See mission to the United Nations. Abigail Galván is the communications and program officer of the Crimsonbridge Foundation, former development director of the Religious Freedom Institute, and a 5th National Encuentro delegate. Charlene Howard is an educator and the religion department chair at Archbishop Carroll High School here in Washington. She's a former adult faith formation coordinator in the Archdiocese of Washington and a former principal and teacher at St. Francis de Sales Catholic School. And Stephen White is the executive director of the Catholic Project of Catholic University of America, which seeks to promote the role of the laity in the church and society. He's also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And with that, let's get started. And Meghan, I'd like to talk with you first. In your many roles, you write and you speak frequently on Catholic social thought and how we as Catholics should engage in political and social life. In thinking about this election, you've written that Pope Francis has implored us to pray with the gospel, reject the throwaway culture, and be in kinship with the marginalized. Our understanding of building a pro-life community of solidarity must be a circle in which no one is left out, you've said. Can you expand on that for us? What does rejecting the throwaway culture look like today? What does being a faithful citizen look like in our current context? And how should young people and young Catholics think about this in the politics of 2020?
Thank you, Kim. One of the things that I find in the classroom is that my students really like and they really respond to this image of the throwaway culture, that it captures something makes them so unsettled about what is happening in their communities, what they see around, and what the world that they're going to be graduating and joining looks like. The thing that I think is really at the heart of what Pope Francis argues and what it is that he's illuminating, right? Because it's been there for us to see for quite some time, is just how deep-seated this idea of really a utilitarian idea of, okay, let's see how much we can get, right? So this mix of self-interest and, well, if it's good for the majority, then we're okay. As long as more people are doing better than not, we're okay. And the problem is that what we find in the gospel is a constant push for us to look at those who aren't okay, who don't have enough, who don't have access to power, to the legal system, to their basic necessities and their basic human rights being met. We see it throughout the scripture in the concern for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. And we see it in Pope Francis's priority of talking about the cause of migrants throughout the world. What does this mean for being a faithful citizen here in the United States? I think one of the things that's so difficult about it is it means that I have to position myself to consider not only my fellow citizens, but those within my community who aren't citizens, who don't have the right to vote, who don't have a voice. And am I considering their basic rights, considering them as part of the common good that we're working for? In 2020, for me, that's one of the forefront issues for what is it that the gospel is asking me to consider as I think about voting. And it's a sense of responsibility for those who are part of my community, but do not have the right to have their voices heard the way I do.
Thanks so much, Megan. That's wonderful. And I know, Stephen, that you also talk about the throwaway culture and consider how that you bring that to your analysis of these situations. Just to remind everybody, you're the executive director of the Catholic Project at Catholic University. And you should all know that there's a wonderful podcast out on the clergy sexual abuse crisis from the Catholic Project called Crisis. You're also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And what you've written about that really struck us when we were organizing this discussion was the U.S. Bishop's statement on abortion as the preeminent threat to the seamless garment of Catholic social teaching. How should Catholic voters weigh and prioritize these important diverse issues at the heart of the idea of the throwaway culture? And also, how can young Catholics fit into this discussion and into the politics of 2020?
Yeah, to the first point, I think in that piece you're quoting, I talked about the Catholics are looking for a silver bullet, sort of the one argument that will settle forever the question of who are we supposed to vote for as Catholics. And our bishops have wisely, I think, but also frustratingly for a lot of people on both sides, refrained from answering that question. They've made us do the hard work of making a judgment that doesn't boil down to some kind of political algorithm. Politics isn't the sort of thing where you can punch in sort of an input on one side and it spits out the answer, what should we do, on the other side. That might be easier, but that's just not the world we live in. The bishops have emphasized the issue of abortion as being the preeminent issue. I don't think there's any bishop that I know of in the United States or anywhere else who doesn't think that abortion is wrong, that doesn't think that the church has something to say about this. But I think what's important for understanding the bishop's position is that saying that an issue is a priority is not saying it's the only thing that matters, right? There are lots of issues that matter. There are lots of issues that are urgent, but they've always insisted, or recently especially they've insisted, that abortion is a preeminent issue, both because of how serious an evil abortion is, and because of how widespread it is. I think it's so widespread that a lot of us sort of almost take it for granted. We kill somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million innocent young people every year through abortion in this country. It's hard to look at that number and not think of ourselves as some kind of, it's a monstrous number. It's a monstrous number. And also, abortion is something that tears not just at human life, but it tears at the fabric of the family and at the very foundations of society, where we learn to love one another, to be vulnerable to one another, to care for those who, like all of us, come into this world utterly dependent on others. And so that's a huge issue. It's one the bishops have given priority. It's clearly not the only issue. But the question, I think, then becomes, if we're weighing that against other issues, what could possibly be the counterbalance to an evil like that? This is a debate that probably, frankly, turns off a lot of young people because it's not pleasant to look at, and it's frustrating because there don't seem to be a lot of clear answers. To young people, I would, at least at the outset tonight, say politics are both worse and better than you might think they are. I'm old enough, just old enough, to remember politics that weren't like this. Politics aren't always like this. They don't have to always be like this. I remember when a president failed to win re-election because he rose taxes. Like, that got him kicked out of office. That wasn't that long ago. But I also think that we put too much trust and emphasis on politics at a national level, and we expect our national politics to fix problems that it just can't fix. We could talk about more what I mean about that, but I fall in the pretty homeless camp right now, if that's the big question for the day. I don't know how I could support someone who sees the evil of abortion as a fundamental right. Cardinal Bernardine said pretty much the same thing years ago. At the same time, there aren't a lot of other better alternatives I see knocking around. So the question then becomes one of lesser of two evils. You'll hear that a lot. And I think the question is really, is it the lesser of three evils? Because there's a third option. You don't have to vote for one or the other. You can vote for someone else. I'll leave that sort of sitting in the middle of the room for others to pick up if they want to, but that's sort of where I come down right now.
Well, we are going to come back to that question. And I love how you describe this as there's no silver bullet here. I think we all would agree it's hard to be a Catholic. And one of the reasons is we don't have a silver bullet, a sort of algorithm that we put everything into. But we do have a lot of teachings that help us think about this. And with that, I'd like to go to you, Charlene. You're an experienced Catholic leader. You're a veteran educator who engages with young people on these issues year in and year out. How do you think our volatile current context with racism front and center, the pandemic, an economy that's leaving so many behind, how should that affect our actions as citizens? How do you talk to young people about these issues and about the exercise of political responsibility? And what do you think should guide our choices and our priorities? What issues, character, party, our own interests, what should be the guide for us and for young people? Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. It is a mixed bag for young people. And just to restate, I'm talking to teenagers, 11th graders primarily, most of the time, or young people at my parish who are varying ages. Many of you are young people on the panel from my perspective. And I think the thing that comes across most is that they're looking similar to what Stephen was saying, something to hold on to, something that's concrete because of the fact that there's no right, wrong answer, and helping them to, first of all, recognize the reality of faith, that is a real thing. And what does that mean to you? What does that look like for you? How do you practice that? And what does that mean in terms of how you govern your life? We talk about what moral living is about and moral character, which is something many of them don't have people talking to them about. And so looking at what that means, how you become a moral person affects the relationships you have with people and defines the relationships you have with people. So your relationship with God is the first one. And if that belief, depending on what that belief looks like, then is going to govern how you make decisions, how you relate to others, how you make sense out of all of this. And so I think that is one of the pivotal pieces of this, is for young people to really understand that faith is real, faith is important, and that faith is the place you have to be anchored in, first of all, to be able to even stand in the midst of all of these things, to figure out what direction do I go in. Secondly, I think that for young adults in particular, it's recognizing that we have a responsibility to bring the truth to not only power, to talk truth to power, but also to ourselves, to our neighbors, to our family members, and we have to understand that, again, from the basis of faith. So if you truly believe that God is calling us to love one another, well, what does that look like? That means that you can have a conversation with someone who has diametrically opposite views to you without getting angry, cussing them out, and disparaging them. It means that, wait a minute, there's something to learn in what they're saying. There's a way to understand them. Even to use Pope Francis as an example, a way to accompany them because you're hearing from their perspective and being open to that. So that is also, I think, a really important piece for the young people I talk to, definitely, because they have a very limited view of the world, but also young adults who are bridging out and hearing more things and engaging with other people, that you really have to put yourself in that position where you can listen and you can seek out really opposing positions and love a person through that, which is what we're called to do as Christians, as Catholics, so that you can go on and help to put that together with what you believe and what you understand.
Thank you, Charlene. That's wonderful. And I think it's good to bring this Catholic distinctiveness into this discussion right now. I think it's good to talk about relationship and our responsibility to others, because that is something that's distinctively Catholic, and it's something that we can bring to these discussions. And it means, obviously, that we have responsibilities to others, that our decisions don't happen in a vacuum. Thank you. Abigail, I'd like to talk to you. You are now a delegate to the 5th National Encuentro of Hispanic and Latino Ministry. You've worked to advance religious freedom issues, and you're a proud Georgetown graduate, above all here. How are you and other young people you know thinking about this election? How do you approach it in a way that's informed by the teachings of our faith? And what do you think should guide our choices and our priorities?
Thank you, Kim. Well, I would say that from talking to a lot of my peers, what I've seen is that there's a sense of the weight of these elections, where in very unprecedented times, there are so many unknown factors. And I think that there's like a yearning for justice and for what's good to be manifest. And I think a lot of people are reaching for practical ways in which they can bring that about. Some of the negative things that I've seen that have been exacerbated by the stay-at-home orders has been just kind of like we fall into these like little silos in social media. And so there's a lot of entrenchment in certain views, and then like a lack of, I guess, like openness in our hearts to hear the views of others who have differing opinions. In terms of how do I approach it in a way that's informed by the teachings of the Catholic faith, I think it's very important to remember that since the beginning, disagreement has been a necessary stage in the discovery and articulation of truth. So we saw this in the Council of Jerusalem. We saw this in the Acts of the Apostles. We even saw this in the time in which Christ was living. There were a lot of disagreements, and Christ would take some stance on some of them. And in some, he would say, if they're preaching in my name, let them. So I think that's one thing that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking through these arguments. And then in terms of what should be forming our choices and our priorities, the beatific vision. Okay, we have one final end, and that is our salvation. Mm-hmm. And God is very clear about what will help us attain that. And it's followed by action and truth. And so what we need to have is discerning hearts, and we need to make sure that our eyes are fixed on Christ and they're fixed on the cross. And we need to recognize that we're living in the world that's imperfect, and that no political party, not Biden, not Trump, no one is our Messiah. We have one Messiah, and that is Jesus Christ. And to focus on any of these lesser ends is what's gonna lead us to fall. When Peter was following like Christ, it says in the Bible, he was following him at a distance. And that following him at a distance is what led him to deny Christ 3 times. Now, I think that when we're looking at the bigger picture, there's a lot of things that are going to inform how we behave and react to that. And there's a lot of like policies that we're going to want to advance. And I think that's valid and that's good. That's part of being a good steward. But what we need to be doing is we need to make sure that we're listening, that we're not allowing our hearts to harden, and that we're allowing God to stretch our hearts. We don't know the end game. We don't know what the person in office is going to do or who will end up being in office. I sure was not able to predict that at these last elections, and I have no idea what's going to happen next. The best thing we can do is form ourselves, keep God at the center, and trust that his vision, that he has the world in his hands, and that even if things seem like unfair or unjust, if we keep our eye on him, then we're able to bring him and make him manifest in this world, which is what we're sorely needing right now.
Thanks, Abby. That's very helpful. I think that anybody who's ever sat around a Catholic family dinner table knows that we all know that disagreement is okay, and that's part of our lively engagement with each other. And I also think we all know what discernment is about. I'd like to get to a little bit of that disagreement here in this conversation, and let's see if we can move it forward. And I want to thank you all for helping us set the table here so well. Meghan, maybe I'll start with you. And as we talk about these issues, I'd love it if you could help us out in thinking about what factors should inform our exercise of prudential judgment and a well-formed. We talk a lot in Catholic social teaching about putting forward our principles, implementing our ideas through forming our consciences, through exercising prudential judgment. I'd love for you to give us a little bit of a walkthrough through what that means, and also for you, how it leads you to think about this election and whether you as Catholics should align with a particular party or anybody.
Thanks, Kim. I, many years ago now, got quite frustrated and with the way in which prudential judgment was being thrown around and used in debates about the budget, and famously came out, said prudential judgment is not a get out of jail free card. And one of the things that I think often happens, because it's so complicated, because it's so murky, because there isn't an algorithm to punch in, we look for things that require us to think about them less, because we're searching for some sort of clarity that's hard for us to find pretty much anywhere we look right now, in the middle of the pandemic in particular. But the thing about Catholic social teaching and Christian ethics more broadly is that more is always asked of us. It's always more that is asked of us. Above my desk sitting here is a Post-it note with Micah 6:8. What is it that the Lord asks of you? To live justly, to love mercifully, and to walk humbly with your God. So now how do we do that when we're trying to figure out how to vote? And part of it is that we need to practice listening as an ethical practice. And part of that is listening to those we disagree with. But I would say even more than listening to those we disagree with, it's listening to those whose lives and experiences are different from our own. I may disagree with a family member, and that's a different kind of thing because I know their story, right? And even those disagreements take on a different flavor than when you're in the public square. And so for me, that starting point as I'm listening is to look around and say, okay, whose voice am I not hearing? Whose voice isn't present? And yes, that, on the one hand does include those we cannot see, and many, Catholics who are within the Democratic Party don't perhaps want to talk about. That is the question of the unborn, but it's also the question of those living in poverty. It's also the question of the unemployed. It's also a question of my friend who is afraid that if she drives just a little bit over the speed limit, a police stop might be fatal. It's perspectives and voices that we otherwise don't hear in those echo chambers of our social media. That is where we have to start, because prudential judgment isn't purely an individual thing. It's learning, right? It's see, judge, act. It's learning everything we can about an issue. But there's this line I love in Lumen Fide, which is that kind of joint document from Pope Francis and Pope Benedict, in a sense, right? Benedict was writing it when he abdicated, when he retired, that self-knowledge is only possible when within the community, greater memory of the community. And I think that's helpful when we think about prudential judgment in terms of politics. Because yes, I have to make a decision and I'm responsible for it, but I cannot make that decision based purely on my own knowledge, purely on my own experience. And I can't make it looking only at what are the easy issues.
Thanks, Meghan. I feel like that's so helpful. And I feel like one aspect of prudential judgment is looking at the context, looking at the details, looking at the particulars of our situation. And so let me bring this down to brass tacks here and what's going on right now. And Stephen, I'll go to you with this. As people exercise their prudential judgment, as they think about how they're going to vote, let's move from the abstract to the particular. We have 185,000 deaths from COVID. We see people dying on TV in the streets. We see these awful instances of people being murdered because of their skin color, hundreds of thousands of abortions, a new federal death penalty. What can young people do to shake up our church, to bring that sense of urgency to our conversation here about these major moral issues? And how should this urgent, just incredibly volatile situation we're in right now inform our judgment about the candidates we're looking at, the candidates on the table here in our presidential election?
Yeah, I wish I had a more satisfying answer to that question. I mean, I think in a lot of ways that the profound dysfunction we see in our politics, and not just our politics, our common life, such as it is right now, a lot of the things that we notice and that we see are symptoms of much deeper problems. I think that part of that, this is just a piece of this, so I don't want to make it sound like this is the whole solution, but a part of that is that when we talk about our obligations as citizens or how we can exercise our citizenship prudently, almost always we're talking about voting. And voting is important. It is. I don't want to downplay that. But most of the work of citizenship that we do happens outside the voting booth. Most of the work of good citizenship and of being Christian citizens, Catholic citizens, happens long before we ever decide to show up on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. And there's this reduction of citizenship of our common life together to the act of voting that I think both overstates the importance of our elections. They become these desperate affairs that cost billions of dollars and get everybody really upset. And at the same time, they leave out so many opportunities where most of the work of citizenship has to be done. And there's a lot of work to be done. You can see that not just by sort of the mess that we see around us on TV or on Twitter. Do people watch TV anymore? On Twitter, on social media, wherever. And the work of citizenship can be showing up to vote. It can be showing up to support a protest, hopefully a peaceful protest that you support. Good citizenship starts at home. That sounds like a cliche. I'm sure it's a cliche. You can't expect people to know how to live together well with one another if we don't first learn that in some place. Where do we first learn the virtues of solidarity, the virtues of how to get along with one another? We learn those in the family first, for most of us. We learn it from our teachers, from our neighbors. If those kinds of relationships, and COVID hasn't helped those relationships, let's be honest. If those kinds of relationships aren't forming, then we're not forming the social cohesion that provides the reserves of solidarity that we can draw on in difficult times. And we're not learning the kinds of habits that we need if we're going to live citizenship well, if we're going to serve the common good. Meghan said, I think she's absolutely right. Prudential judgment is not a get out of jail free card, right? Most of the moral decisions we have to make don't reduce simply to principle. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that prudential judgment isn't a get out of jail free card, but we're responsible for our prudent judgments. And when we make awful judgments, they're not prudent. We call them prudential judgments. They're not prudent. Prudence is a virtue, and we have to develop that virtue and learn that virtue and help others learn that virtue. That's the work of citizenship, and it's a lot less glamorous, and it takes a lot more time than showing up to vote once every 4 years or once every 2 years. But I think that's where our biggest political deficit is in a lot of ways, and it manifests itself in all the things that we see going on around us right now, and all the focus and emphasis on the election. Yes, this is for the umpteenth time in a row the most important election ever. I get it. I shouldn't even say that sarcastically. It is an important election, but so if we're not willing to take citizenship seriously on the family level, on the neighborhood level, our national politics are never going to be able to make up that deficit. And I think we see that now. I think we really see that now. Our politics is like a low tide. so much social capital and social cohesion and social goodwill has been squandered over the last decades that old evils that never went away are being sort of revealed at low tide, like rocks in a harbor. Racism, the list goes on and on. These have been part of our society, and as we've sort of torn apart more and more, as we've squandered more and more social capital, I hate that word, but more our sense of community. These old wounds are becoming visible again. And we could talk about the personalities involved, but I think it's much deeper than this election cycle. It's much deeper than the last 10 or 8 or 16 years. And I think the work of citizenship has to address that. And it takes a long time and little by little approach, but that's where the focus needs to be.
I agree with so much of what you've said. And at the same time, it seems to me like something that we've seen so much of in this year, which for me does feel very different, is people exercising their citizenship away from the voting booth. So marching, whether it's the March on Washington or the March for Life, whether it's getting out there in their neighborhoods and communities across the country, and not just for big events, but really pushing for racial justice or pushing for protection for unborn lives. I think we've really seen so much of that this year. My question, I want to pick up on what you've got, and this is for everybody. So I'll just put it out there is, I think we can all agree that the decision regarding who to vote for isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. But I feel like it's tied to who we vote for. So in other words, how should Catholics who support Joe Biden's candidacy respond to his stance on abortion and the potential consequences of his administration for some religious freedom issues? And conversely, how should Catholics who support Donald Trump's candidacy respond to his actions and words on race and immigration and character and other issues? I mean, what responsibilities do we have if we're voting for someone who doesn't represent the fullness of Catholic teaching? What follows from that? Charlene, what do you think?
I just had this conversation. And it took much thought, because I was quick to be glib, and then I realized, since I teach Catholic social teaching all of the time, what came to me is that first and foremost, always, I have a responsibility. So no matter who's in office, if that person is not representing the things that I voted for that person for, if it's a candidate that I was in favor of, I need to hold them accountable. So I need to write, or I need to lobby, or I need to be, do some things and organize. And, I have to be actively involved in holding the person accountable. So that's the first thing. If it's a candidate I didn't vote for, guess what? It's no different. I have to hold the person accountable. I have to continue to talk, to lobby, to organize, to be more informed, maybe understand how it is that people are so opposite to the way I'm thinking. It should be plain and simple and easy. Why don't they get it? And not be so ready to convince them on my position, but let me hear the reasoning behind their position. It may be logical, it may make a lot of sense, but it certainly is going to bring me some information I did not know before. And then I have to take that and ruminate and discern and pray and investigate the scriptures, talk to other people whose opinions I trust and value, who are coming from a faith-based perspective, because that's really important too. And then just pray and think, and that's where that reason and spirit come together. You have to give it the time it needs to have a response that you feel at least that, okay, Lord, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. I pray that it's what you want me to do. Let me know. And sure enough, when you do that over time, and maybe time is one of the hard things for young adults, but it's a process, and God works out a process. So you have to allow yourself that time to let it ruminate, to let it sit in your spirit for a while, to sit in your psyche for a while. And I can tell you that eventually you will get an answer, or you will see things that happen that cause you to realize, oh, okay, this is it. But the bottom line is we have to do something. we have a responsibility to hold folks accountable, whether we wanted them in office or not, because they are human beings and they are fallible, just like us. And we can't hold them straight unless we do that. That's what I do with my children. I always held them accountable. That's what I do with my students. And I ask them to hold me accountable, because then that's how we engage in what Stephen was just talking about. You know, I'm not just the big authority. I'm a pilgrim on a journey just like you. So let's hold each other accountable.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And I want to say that right now we're going to switch to Q&A from you all out there. We have a long line of questions coming in. You can email your questions in. The information should be at the bottom of your screen right now. Abby, I want to start with you for this one, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to weigh in. Eileen writes in and asks, what can young people do to shake up our church? Our common life is filled with dysfunction. Our civic life, our church life, family life is permeated with dysfunction right now, and we see it all around us. What can young people do differently? What can you do to shake up our church? And what do you see people doing that you know?
Okay. What I'll say is the answer is going to be very particular to you, right? Like, I think in this conversation, it's been said, we're looking at the national level and it's very abstract. So what are the experiences and things that have formed you as an individual? What are the causes that either you're encountering or that you become aware of? And then what is your response going to be? So like when we look at the abstract, I think it's difficult to see what our role is and what our response should be. Like, and we see this even like in the church, like when God was in the abstract, we needed him to become incarnate and to become a person who was able to speak to us in a way that we could understand, who could love us and touch us and show us what it was God had been trying to instill in his people from the very beginning. Okay. And then the other thing too is, I think today's the nativity of Our Lady. And so we can always like rest in her and rest in the fiat. Okay. We're not responsible for how things are going to end up. Okay. But God made you a particular person in a particular time with particular experiences. And you have your own personal fiat to give to the Lord. When he made Mary, Mary was not concerned with the Gentiles, with us. She could not see us sitting here millions of years later, hundreds of years, thousands of years later, like discussing these things. The world today looks so different than it did before. We cannot even imagine where God is going to continue to take this. And so all we can do is continue to form ourselves. And then, honestly, have courage and listen and converse. And like, I know dialogue gets a bad rep. It's like you're dialoguing in search of truth. Okay. And so you need to just like make yourself available. Who is the Good Samaritan? The person who responds to the issue and the person at hand. That's going to look very different for many of us. But I guess what we can do is just be thoughtful and be reflective and keep our eye on God.
Thanks. That's wonderful. Stephen, I'm going to throw this one to you since it's something you brought up at the beginning. And we have this question from a number of people. Colleen and Caitlin, both here in Maryland, and others as well have asked it. And the question is twofold. What do you think about voting for a third party in this election on the basis of its adherence to a wider range of Catholic social teaching? Is that an option that you think is either legitimate or advised? Is it something you might do? How about sitting out the election completely and saying that you can't vote for any of the candidates? I'd love for others of you to weigh in on this question, but I'd like to start with you, Stephen.
I am a believer in going to cast a vote, even if it's not for one of the two main party candidates. I've kind of made the soft case against for voting either one of them, but let me push back on my own self right here. We are called as Catholics not to find salvation in this world, right? As Abigail was saying, keep your eyes on Christ. We don't have to fix this world. The world doesn't need us to save it. It has a savior already. That's true. But we do that. We follow God by working in this world, right? We're incarnate beings too. So we are called to work for justice. We know that we're not going to bring it about of our own accord. but we're called to do that. And we're called to make tough choices that we should face with humility in difficult political circumstances. Sometimes that even makes making distasteful choices we'd rather not have to make, but they're ours to make. And so we do the best that we can. So I've kind of made the case, a pox on both their houses, go do your own way. But I would stop short of recommending that to other people, because I don't think that I think prudent people of goodwill will arrive at different places on that. That some people may be able to say, ask the question, what am I willing to tolerate in a candidate that will justify my vote? I feel like a lot of people, and a lot of young people, especially these days, are looking for the lesser of two evils. They're almost casting a vote against someone or another rather than voting for someone they really support. And that's not a pleasant situation to be in, but that doesn't mean you just throw up your hands and you walk away. We're called to love the world that we find, not the world as we wish it was. And so we can't simply throw up our hands and trying to absolve ourselves of the difficult situation. We are part of a political community. We are obliged to act for the common good. Sometimes that means getting dirty. Sometimes that means getting down in the muck. Sometimes that means making choices that give us the heebie-jeebies just to think about them. But then we have to go out and do what we think is best. What will best serve the common good? And that's a tough question. It's never an easy question. I think this year it's a particularly tough question when it comes to voting. And that's my completely unsatisfying non-answer to your very fine question, ladies.
Well, my sort of moving on to another great question from some of our viewers. Someone asked, what is the connection, and maybe I'll go to you for this first, and anybody else who wants to weigh in. What is the connection between Black Lives Matter and we are the pro-life generation for young Catholics? And in particular, how do we think about the idea of systemic sin, systemic racism, structures of sin in these kinds of conversations?
The question builds on what Steve was just talking about. Because to add on what he'd say, I just want to say every decision you make is one that you're responsible for, even the one you choose not to make. And so, right, all of our political engagement is bounded, right? There will never in your life be a perfect candidate who you will agree with everything on, who has the perfect policies, precisely because there is no Messiah coming in American politics. But I think what I find when I talk to my students is actually that they're not nearly as negative as maybe some of the young people Steve was referring to. And that is, I teach at a campus that before 2016 was not particularly politically active. You didn't see much. And in the last 4 years, I've seen students mobilizing, and they are mobilizing for Black Lives Matter. And there is a growing sense of we are a pro-life generation that is much broader and more inclusive, and to be perfectly honest, a lot more appealing than the one that I was part of when I was in high school and college. Precisely because it refuses to stay within what are seen as the easier questions and recognizes that everything is interrelated. I think one of the things that for me is particularly important in this election, and I'm a social ethicist, so voting's a really big deal for me. The calls, the letter, all of it is, but voting's a really big deal for me. Is that throwing up your hands is something my students, they give me energy when I see that they're not willing to do that. But there's also this sense in which, what right do I have to kind of throw up my hands and not participate when I see the courage of the students in Parkland and the students in Chicago coming together and demanding that the adults around them start actually listening and acting for their benefit. I think if we look to Black Lives Matter, it's young people who are said enough and demanding change. And that's, I think, something that those of us who are a little bit older, we can find hope there. Because if you're looking for where the Spirit is moving, it doesn't always move where you expect it. And more often than not, as a teacher, I find it out of the mouths and actions of the young people I'm around.
Thank you. I see that too. And I want to get to a question that a lot of people are asking here regarding variety of religious leaders. There seems to be a real pushback against bishops, priests, religious talking about these issues. So someone, just to pick Meredith's question here, and Abby, I'd love your opinion on this first and anybody else to weigh in. But Meredith says, Sister Dee Dee's presence at the Republican National Convention felt polarizing in that the Catholic community was both empowered and infuriated by her presence there. And similarly, Sister Simone Campbell's presence at the Democratic National Convention was similarly empowering and polarizing for different people. A bishop has recently said that you can't be a Catholic and a Democrat. All of these situations, do you think that our religious leaders should be taking those kinds of positions on the national stage? Abby, let's start with you and then anyone else.
Thank you. So I guess, do I think they should be doing this? No, I don't think so. I think that they need to exercise prudence, but it's difficult because I understand both sides, right? And so to tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about my background, I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants. My dad came at the age of 14 because his youngest sister died of malnourishment. He came to work and has been working in the US since. My mom came like a little bit after high school and has been working in cleaning houses. My parents have given their entire life for us and for my siblings. And that was a life of sacrifice. So like the immigration issue has always been the issue that I vote on. Okay. What I will say is that I then went on to work at the Religious Freedom Institute, right? And at the Religious Freedom Institute, I see the importance of having people just witness to the faith. Okay. And there is a beauty and there is an empowerment that comes from I think seeing like people of faith being allowed to witness, where a lot of people of faith feel like they're being told to be quiet on both sides, right? It doesn't matter on what issue, it's just like the secular world that we live in. And so I can see why people are inspired and empowered by that. But then there's also the reality that that there is no political party that is completely aligned with God. And so in a sense, you're kind of weaponizing these things. And now I'm going to bring a piece of scripture that I've been reflecting on. In Bible study, we talked about when Jesus heals one of the paralytics and he says, he chooses to use the words, your sins have been forgiven. And now I'm going to get this part wrong. It's either a Pharisees or a Sadducees who says, who are you to say that their sins can be forgiven? And the commentary on that is that this very devout Jew felt threatened because it was blasphemy that someone could say only God can forgive, right? Who are you to say this? And then the other thing too was that he was already looking ahead and seeing how this would deteriorate at the structure of Judaism had been put in place to keep Jewish people close to God, right? So like that's a good end, like keeping your eye on God, walking alongside God. But his investment was on the political structure and he was thinking about the end game and trying to think ahead. And so what was the result of that? The result of that was that Jesus Christ himself was before him and he was not able to recognize him. Okay. Now, I think that we do this a lot in our own politics. We talk about social justice warriors and we talk about like the pro-life people and we cannot be doing this. Like, you know, one of the things that Christ said is they will know you by the love that you have for one another, which Charlene mentioned. And in the Acts of the Apostles and in all of the letters, we see that people were converted because they saw the love that they had for one another. We're not seeing that now. And we're forgetting that there should be some element of trust and charity when we see other Catholics speaking on issues that perhaps chafe at us. And that's okay, because we can't grow in virtue unless we have conflict, right? And so I think that like a better response, is it frustrating? Yes, I don't like it. It honestly frustrates me sometimes. I get down in the dumps and I have to open up the Bible to read it to feel a little bit better. But what I think we need to keep in mind is when we encounter these things, are we like, what is it that's chafing at us? And then is that in line with what Christ has taught us? Like, are we just reacting to something that we've been taught is wrong? Or are we truly seeking truth and truly hoping to evangelize? So that was like a very long and twisted answer. And I hope I got to the crux of it, which is we can't be so invested in what we believe is the end game that we miss Christ acting before us.
No, it was a great answer. And Charlene, I think it leads into something I want to ask you, which is, Abby talks about the polarization, the bitter polarization we're facing. And I wonder, someone here is asking, what do we do about that? What's our responsibility as Catholics to respond to that polarization in public life? And, because on the one hand, we have a responsibility to really act for justice. And that causes us to take strong positions. We should take strong positions. We shouldn't be the least common denominator, that shouldn't be the basis of our vote. And at the same time, we have to react to this polarization. How do we do that?
Well, my thoughts go way back to basic catechism, and that is, to some degree, that we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. We get caught up with the wrong things. I mean, we see what people do, we don't like what they do, or we know a better way, and that is as it ought to be. But at the end of the day, Jesus always loved. He confronted, he held people accountable, he pushed back, but he still loved. That is to say, he preserved the dignity of every human being, regardless of their acts, because he knew there was more at stake than just the results of their actions, but their salvation was at stake. And we forget that because we're human beings, we deal with what we can see, what we can manage with our senses. And so therefore, in looking at our entrenched positions, we are falling away from recognizing that dignity of other people. It's just me, what I feel, what I can control, what I want to do, what I think is right. Control. Well, control is not your God. Jesus Christ is your God. Okay. And just like Meghan said, which is one of my favorite scriptures, walk humbly before your God. That's the last thing he says. And what do we remember always? The last thing somebody says. So he put that at the end so we can remember that. Walk humbly. We're not in control. God provides the increase. God makes things happen. He makes all things new. If we trust that, there goes that relationship again. If we truly say we are who we are, the people of God, the Catholic people, then we've got to step it back and recognize, no, you have your job. You're supposed to be informed. You're supposed to speak truth to power. You're supposed to do that, but still it's all in Christian love. And at the end of the day, it's God who's going to make the change. It's not me. But I can make the change I can as I'm directed by God and as I believe God is leading me. And as I said before, looking back and seeing, did I do the right thing? And I have to interject this piece here because it's been kind of burning. And this is also important to us as Catholic people, reconciliation. We have fallen away from the practice of that most beautiful sacrament. It almost feels like you can if you want. You don't have to. Because I think now, and forgive me if I'm misspeaking, so any of the other panelists can correct me, but we're only obligated twice a year. And when I was growing up, I hate saying that. I never say that. But when I was growing up, every week. Now, I didn't understand it then, but boy, do I understand it now. It helps you to develop that humility with God, that your stuff does stink sometimes. But guess what? So does that other person. So if you can be forgiven and you know what that feels like, then you can forgive others. And that just means you can open up the possibility that, okay, that wasn't quite right, but I don't have to pounce on them. I don't have to put it on Twitter. I don't have to chat about it. I don't have to tear them to pieces. I don't have to call up their office and tell them what kind of so-and-so and so. Whoa, wait a minute. That's not following Christ either. He never did that. Even though he may have used strong words, true words, to hold someone accountable, and they either accepted it or they didn't. Even at that point, as God, he did not force anyone to do anything, because you have to choose to love. So, you know, that's a long response, right, to a short answer. But those things are key to what makes us Catholic. The further, I mean, I think if you really look at it, the further we get away from those things that make us truly who we are in our faith, and those doctrinal things that Christ instituted, that's part of where that problem is coming from, because we don't have the touchstone anymore. So yes, young people, you might think, oh, she's talking crazy. No, reconciliation, baby. That's one of the things you need to go back to seeking. And I bet you will start to see some changes in the way you think and the decisions that you make.
I couldn't agree more. 100% agree with that. Thank you so much for bringing that to this conversation, Charlene. And now as we get to the end of our time together, I'm going to ask everybody to send us off with one piece of advice for young people, one action step that they can take to live as faithful citizens during this crucial election. Steve, let's start with you.
I'm going to just piggyback off Charlene. Go to confession. I'm not even joking. She's so 100% right about that. It's hard to be upset with other people. It's hard to be angry with other people. It's hard to judge other people when you've experienced God's mercy, especially in a sacramental confession. Pope Francis is A+ 100% right on this. Charlene's right on this. So I'm going to go with that. Go to confession.
Okay. How about you, Megan?
Well, I think what both Charlene and Steve are pointing to is everything looks and acts differently when you recognize your own human dignity. It makes it a lot easier to see the dignity of others. And so I want to say the one thing is, right, let yourself feel that unconditional love, because then you'll be able to hold people accountable, avoid things like gossip, but you also will expect and demand that your dignity be respected in all of those encounters. It's one thing that always bugs me about discussions about overcoming polarization, is that oftentimes that puts a greater burden on those whose dignity isn't being accepted in the first place. Like they're supposed to play nice for the sake of not being so polarized. But my real action item is, and I say this to my students all the time, get informed. Nothing is as great a threat to unjust social structures as an educated and empowered youth prepared to organize. So don't just go out and vote. Ask your family members, are they registered to vote? Do they know where to go vote? And more than even that right now, have they filled out the census? That's another part of being a good citizen and participating so that our communities get what they need.
Thanks so much for that, Megan. How about you, Charlene? One action step or piece of advice.
I say practice being open and listening to all points of view, and then be prayerful. Go into prayer about those things. Compare them to the scriptures and the teachings of the church to help you discern, and allow that time to happen. Don't be so quick. There's no sound bites in God. It takes time. So be okay with being still. Be okay with something not coming to you till maybe next month, but it's gonna come. If you earnestly seek his face, he's going to answer you. So please take your faith seriously, and those things that feed you, do those things or cultivate them if you haven't done them in a long time.
Thank you. Abby, round us out here.
Okay, so everyone's already said everything that needs to be said, so I'll share a prayer that I go to often. It's called Patient Trust. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually, let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time, that is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your own goodwill will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit gradually forming within you will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete.
Thank you so much, Abby. That's a wonderful way to close us out here. And I want to thank all of you for this important conversation. 2020 has been a year like no other, and this election is clearly crucial. There's a hunger for a moral vocabulary out there. We've seen that here tonight. And as we approach this election, we can see that Catholic social teaching gives us that vocabulary. And I think we should remember that human life and dignity is on the ballot. Solidarity is on the ballot. Justice is on the ballot. The common good is on the ballot. The option for the poor and vulnerable is on the ballot. And it's up to us to fill that out and to think about how to best do that, to pray. Let's reflect. Let's pray. Let's act. Let's vote. And with all that, I'd like to thank you all for being involved in this discussion. And particularly, I'd like to thank our partners at the Archdiocese of Washington's DCCatholic Young Adult Ministry. And their action step was to ask me to remind you to sign up for the weekly newsletter for Catholic young adults in DC by texting this number you see at the bottom of your screen. I would also tell you that the recording of this conversation will be posted to our website and social channels for later viewing. And we have 2 upcoming conversations that I'm excited about. On Tuesday, September 15th, a week from today, please join us for a major online public dialogue on what's faith got to do with it. Reporters on faith and the faithful in this election. We'll have Jack Jenkins from Religion News Service, Eugene Scott from the Washington Post, Elizabeth Shupak from Pew, and others. And then on Tuesday, October 13th, we're again going to be partnering with our friends at DC Catholic's Theology on Tap program for a Salt and Light online gathering for young adult Catholics on religion and race, the future of anti-racism in the Catholic Church. Look for more information on both of those discussions soon. I want to thank our friends Jonathan Lewis and Molly Herrera at DC Catholic for their partnership in this important and timely conversation. I want to thank the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, Optimum Audio, and AI Media for helping us with the technical end of things. Many, many thanks to my colleagues, John Carr and Anna Misla, who are the man and woman behind the curtain here today. And finally, thanks to our wonderful panel, Meghan Clark, Abigail Galván, Charlene Howard, and Stephen White for their outstanding participation in this gathering. Thanks again, and hope you can join us in the future.